Hi, I'm Earl Taylor, Chief Knowledge Officer at the Marketing Science Institute. As many of you know, MSI helps marketers become better marketers. Our business and academic thought leaders collaborate to create new marketing knowledge, which we share in a variety of ways. And one of the most popular is our online lunch lecture series. Those of you attending today represent many business sectors such as travel, CPG, financial services, and more, as well as MSI members such as Adobe, Colgate-Palmolive, Facebook, Ford, GFK, and others. We're delighted to welcome you to learn more about designing consumer AI. Before we begin, I'd like to point out the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please use this feature to send through any questions you have during the presentation. We'll gather the questions and have a brief Q&A session following the presentation. Now, I'd like to introduce you to today's featured speakers. Stefano Puntoni is Professor of Marketing at the Rotterdam School of Management at Erasmus University of the Netherlands. Most of his ongoing research investigates how new technology is changing consumption in society, with a focus on automation, artificial intelligence, and the general topic of technological unemployment. Marcus Giesler is Associate Professor of Marketing at York University's Schulich School of Business and Director of the Big Design Lab. He specializes in the study of market creation and customer experience design, with a specific focus on culture and sociology of technology consumption. So with that, we'll turn it over to Stefano and Marcus to tell us about designing consumer AI.
Thank you, Earl, and welcome everybody to this webinar. And give us just a second to set ourselves up. So, welcome again. It's a pleasure to be able to do this. My name is Stefano, and Marcus and I will be presenting also on behalf of our co-authors, Rebecca Resnick from the Ohio State University and Simona Botti from the London Business School. So this is let's see if it works. Maybe you can click, let's see if, yeah. So this is a picture of ours that we took at the last conference we met. We are researchers in consumption, and we are interested in understanding how people make choices regarding consumption in particular, and especially in technology-enabled markets. Now, let me start by asking you a question. And Marcus, I don't seem to have a control.
Okay, I'll do it. By the way, this is Marcus.
I'm not entirely sure why.
Okay.
So, what do you see here? I don't know if many of you can recognize it. This is a screenshot of the cinematic masterpiece, 2001: Space Odyssey, where David Bowman, the character, is trying to switch off the spaceship computer. We're all familiar with images like this one, from movies or from books, where something goes really wrong with technology and with artificial intelligence in particular. Four of us were starting to think about the technology around us today and how it can generate feelings and thoughts that may or may not be conducive to adopting the technology only a few months ago. And we're very grateful to MSI for giving us the opportunity to work on this. We met as part of a new program the MSI put together called MSI Scholars. And as part of that, we had a chance to spend a few days in Breckenridge, Colorado, and start working on this project. And so we are going to tell you a little bit about what we did in the last 6 months and the conceptual frameworks and idea that we have with regard to consumer adoption of AI solutions that are consumer facing, so consumer AI. And Marcus, I'll give it over to you.
So the 2001 story that Stefano has just recalled here is an example of what we refer to as AI dystopias, cautionary tales outlining the dehumanizing effects of AI on our existence, our values such as freedom, privacy, and dignity, that when circulated in popular culture can stimulate anxieties towards consumer AI. And as such, they can also undermine the success of our AI consumer solution. So AI dystopias are everywhere in our popular imagination through classic science fiction stories such as Metropolis or Frankenstein, but also in movies and television programs such as 2001: A Space Odyssey, as Stefano mentioned, or the famous Netflix show Black Mirror. These are fictional tales and they exist in a fantasy world, but as we will argue today, they can also have an influence on how our consumers think about your AI solution in the real world. So we argue that consumer perceptions are driven, shaped, and constrained not only by the actual features of the AI, but also by highly emotional and highly fictional tales and stories. And we are actually also not the first to argue this at all. Previous consumer researchers, with the help of MSI, I should say, have consistently diagnosed an ambivalent or paradoxical stance towards technology, such as machines, techniques, algorithm, or anything else that we might label artificial. So consumers are actually alternating between technophilic stories, stories that present technology as our salvation, and technophobic stories, stories that see technology as our damnation. So if you look at a number of consumer AI products that are pretty popular, this is kind of the space that we want to study here. These kind of ambiguities that consumers experience are also very true on the sort of phenomenological level. So for instance, I'm an avid Spotify user, and I love their playlists, and I love the fact that the Spotify algorithm is suggesting music to me. But the other day, Spotify suggested in the Made For You section an assortment of breakup songs and breakup playlists, making me wonder if there was something wrong with my life and whether Spotify knows things that I don't know yet. So consumers have a love-hate relationship with AI. And that suggests that the dystopian imagination, that which makes us doubt that I want these products in my life, has some relevance. So when we started our project, we also had a hunch that prediction would be very much at the center of consumer AI, as in all AI. So we turned to important work that's been done in the marketing space around artificial intelligence by Jay Graval, Josh Gantz, and Avi Goldfarb down the road from where I am here in Toronto at the Rotman School of Management. And when we gathered as a team, this was actually one of the books that we all had read at the time, and we really liked it. So according to AJ, Josh, and Avi, these AI products are appealing to consumers and to companies alike because they contain prediction technology. All these devices that you've just seen on the previous slide are recent advances in prediction and better, faster, cheaper prediction. We find their work extremely useful and visionary, and when you read their book, which is, by the way, something we strongly encourage you to do, you will note that they begin with prediction and end on the note of society. So one question we had was, what happens when we do this the opposite way? What happens when we start with society and the law of hate ambiguities that I just pointed out? So from our point of view as well, prediction sits very much at the core of consumer AI. But we also argue that prediction is only one AI capability among many others, and that companies succeed by understanding prediction, but also by understanding how prediction interacts with other AI capabilities, and also how it interacts with society at large. So with that, back to the next slide and Stefano.
We basically have here the complete framework, at least the outline of the capabilities together with the negative side that might come with that. Basically, our thinking was, if we define a system as the three parts and we associate capabilities to them, then the next step would become to think about how those capabilities may be associated to negative inferences or assumptions a consumer may have about AI. And for that reason, we paired capabilities with dark sides. So if a capability is listening, then we define a dark side of eavesdropping. For the capability of predicting, we associated the dark side of typecasting to that of producing the dark side or replacing, and finally for that of interacting, the dark side of pretending. And we basically use that conceptualization as a way of thinking about what negative thoughts AI may generate among consumers. And that is a starting point to really think about also what might be the barriers ultimately to the adoption of consumer AI solutions. Just to make one example, we could look at the capability of typecasting. And just one example we saw in the media just a few days ago, actually. This is from earlier this month. An article came out in The Economist talking about how the American government is bringing Facebook to court for essentially allowing advertisers to exclude entire social categories from advertising for housing. This might be, for example, coupled with children or people from particular groups of society and so on. And so this is just one example of how the capability of predicting might be sometimes also have a negative side, and might be, in this case, lead to typecasting and possibly aversive outcomes for consumers. Now, Marcus, over to you.
Okay, so as Stefano just mentioned, there's a hint of a powerful relationship between these AI dark side, eavesdropping, typecasting, replacing, and pretending, and something else. And that something else is likely culture. And what we argue is that that sort of relationship manifests in the AI dystopias, these negative images and meanings about AI that are circulated in popular culture. The problem is, however, that while we have a pretty general understanding of tech dystopias and popular culture, we don't really know at this point what these AI dystopias are and how prevalent they would be in 2019, let's say. So do they really influence the conversation around consumer AI, or are they just an empirical sideshow? So to find out, we drew on the dark sides that Stefano just mentioned to create a language dictionary that we would typically associate with AI dystopia. So for instance, for the case of eavesdropping, we use words such as privacy, spy, spying, listening, eavesdropping, and so on. And then we analyze the prevalence of these words relative to the entire text in a data set of some 9,614 articles from over 400 everyday media outlets published between 2013 and 2018. Really anything published in a newspaper that had the words AI or artificial intelligence in the title that we can find in the EBSCO database. So importantly, we control for the number of publications and the number of words in each publication. But what we were then interested in is understanding the relative occurrence of these formulations in the text. So how influential are these dystopias in shaping generalized perceptions around consumer AI? Now, before I present the findings of all of this, let us just all take a step back and ask ourselves, would we expect these dystopias to be less or more prevalent over time? So we thought, given the excitement around consumer AI and given that consumer AI is arguably more accepted now than, let's say, 5 or 6 years ago, we would expect them to go down over time, right? Clearly, that would be what we would expect. And clearly, the dystopian imagination around AI should matter less today than maybe 5 or 6 years ago. But that's not what happened. Actually, the opposite happened. So as you can see, there is a concrete empirical evidence for the existence of these dystopias. And what's more, their occurrence has gone up considerably over time. You can also see some bumps that have been influenced by other events in society, such as the last presidential election in the US and the Cambridge Analytica scandal that went along with it. But without going into too much detail about the specific shape of each curve for now, what this means in simple language is that the public conversation around AI is increasingly consumed by these dystopias. And as such, it is reasonable to argue that they also have a profound influence on shaping how consumers think about your AI solution or act around your AI solution. So the dystopias are not a sideshow, but they sit very much at the core of it all. And as such, they need to be in the model. Back to Stefano.
So just to wrap the framework up, this is the visual represents our entire framework. Now what we see here, we start at the top with the artificial intelligence, which is defined as a system. And this system, it's made of these three stages associated, as we just spoke earlier, to capabilities and dark side. And finally, those dark side lead to a dystopian myth, to basically themes within culture, popular culture, the media, how people think and write about AI and the news, that basically build on those dark sides to provide a more, let's say, a dark society, societal scenario or myth. We have four different dystopias that we have identified in the corpus of data that Marcus just described and that we talked about in the paper. The first one we call Always On, and it's basically a dystopian society around the notion of privacy and surveillance. And this is basically most obviously associated to the first element of the consumer AI system, which is data collection and storage. The second dystopia we call Unequal Opportunity. And this one, building on the notion of typecasting and, for example, the kind of thoughts that people may have related to the Facebook story that we just talked about from the Economist News line. It's about basically AI contributing to a world where there is unequal access to resources, opportunities, and so forth. This one, because building on the typecasting, is most closely associated to the capability of predicting. And then we have two dystopias for output systems. One that is about doing and one that is about interacting. The first one, it's building on the dark side of replacing, we call human irrelevance. It's about dystopian myths that are concerned with humans being out of job, out of occupation, out of hobbies, out of basically activities that now they enjoy doing because now machines can and will take over those tasks. Can do them and take over. And the final one is more about the notion of interacting. We call it fake reality dystopia. And here is about AI acting as a social actor and essentially replacing humans in social interactions without necessarily humans knowing about the fact that this is a simulated social actor, or maybe knowing it, but in the process perhaps alienating him or herself from the actual real world. So if we go to the next slide, we have just four examples of how those dystopias might be represented in popular culture. These are just four, let's say, famous media, let's say, themes that we see repeatedly across a range of books and movies and articles and discussions. And Always On, of course, most closely associated probably to the notion of Big Brother and the famous 1984 book by George Orwell. We already mentioned very briefly at the beginning Metropolis, this landmark movie from the 30s where Fritz Lang imagines a sci-fi society where the world is divided between rich people and the rest of us who are basically toiling in the horrible factories. And then for the last two, Schwarzenegger and Skynet is one example of human irrelevance where machines at some point just decide that they're better off without us. And finally, for fake reality, we have a more recent movie as an example here, Her, you might have seen it. And it's about basically people striking relationships, even romantic ones, with AI. And as part of that process, perhaps giving up on opportunities in the real world. Now, what we did with this framework next is to think about how do we can think about ways of dealing with these dystopias as managers. So you as managers, if you are in an industry where maybe some of these one or more of these dystopias may be irrelevant, what can you do about it? And so our way of thinking about this is to articulate for each of the dystopias two approaches, which we call the reassure and reframe. And these two approaches don't necessarily work in isolation, but together, or different actors in an industry might take different actions. But essentially, these are managerial choices and behaviors that may help increase consumer acceptance for AI among those consumers who do worry about those dystopian myths that we just described. Just to highlight briefly what this means, a reassure approach would be to just, as the word says, reassure consumers that that dark side capability and the dystopia that builds on it are in fact not there. And the reframe approach instead would be to acknowledge the capability, but try to draw attention away from the dark side and basically the dystopia by trying to convince that yes, we do this, but we do it for the purpose of serving customers and delivering amazing customer experiences, not for more sinister or worrying aims that the dystopian myth might assume. So I leave it to Marcus to make one example, and we don't have the time to go through the entire paper, so please email us if you want to know more. But Marcus, over to you.
Okay, so let's put some of this to work by looking at one very popular consumer AI solution right now, Amazon's Alexa voice assistant, which I take many of us have in their homes, but there are also many consumers who obviously remain utterly skeptical, and that's because there's a fair bit of negative media attention around it. So when we review some of the headlines and articles, it becomes clear that consumer skepticism revolves around Alexa's dark side of eavesdropping. And we can argue that there's an underlying sort of always-on dystopia that amplifies these negative media perceptions. Now, from there, we can do several things. Either we can reassure consumers offering information that demonstrates that we abide by generalized requirements around data privacy. That is, we educate consumers around what type of data is collected and that they can trust Amazon and Alexa in their homes. And some of you might remember Apple's antenna gate scandal a few years ago, the story around the iPhone's allegedly faulty antenna design. Back then, Apple kept tirelessly emphasizing that its antenna design is cutting edge, that it has a sort of team of very capable engineers testing it, and that it is therefore an unwarranted concern. So it becomes clear that this strategy has some clear benefits, but also some limitations. In fact, it could be argued that the very act of consistently hammering this information into the consumer's mind doesn't nurture trust, but actually nurtures the dystopias. It is for this reason then that we would sometimes under certain conditions refer to reassure as a bit of a defensive strategy. And so what we then also argue in the paper is that there's an alternative path that you can choose. And you can also look at our model and understand that there's an interactive relationship between your consumer's AI capabilities and potential dark sides. So you can use it to monitor negative discourse around your consumer AI solution and to devise strategic responses that help reframe a particular consumer AI message. So from that perspective, your consumer AI does entail listening here on the left in the model, but also other key capabilities further to the right. And there's a role for time, and then there are these different meanings stemming from one capability that can be used to effectively downplay the negative associations related to another. So as such, we could shift the conversation from always on to always safe. And once we do that, the dystopian imagination around listening suddenly acquires a different quality. It becomes more bearable, and the negative implications sort of disappear as a different set of images and meanings around the production of safety and shelter are amplified. So here are two examples that we just want to briefly highlight of ads that operate in this vein. Here's a Google Home ad that drives on this aspect of always safe. So on the consumer level, this then stimulates a more positive trade-off. Sure, it's always on, but that's precisely what guarantees always safe and always happy for my family. Here's another example. Here's an Arlo Pro ad adopting a similar rhetoric. So if your communication shifts the focus on a different set of actors here, individuals outside of the home, which are obviously rendered negatively as intruders, Arlo Pro's capability of listening suddenly acquires a more positive meaning. So to summarize, think of our model as sort of like a possibility space, or as the quantum physicists would say, a superposition, you know, a map of sorts that allows us to think of our consumer AI solution in more holistic terms. There are a number of capabilities and dark sides to your offering, but also success in that model would be described not so much as a matter of creating, one great capability or two great capabilities, but rather a harmonious capability mix among and between those categories. And a matter of adjusting your communications is sort of the key to sort of, creating an AI delivering an AI communication that is definitely greater than the sum of its parts, while at the same time minimizing the risks and minimizing the negative associations consumers and other marketplace stakeholders might have with each of these dark sides. So if there's one thing that we want to leave you with today, it is this. Obviously, we started with 2001: A Space Odyssey, which goes back to Arthur C. Clarke, who was this famous science fiction writer and technologist, who said that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Now, we came to this project asking, what gets you and your company to this level of magic? Clarke's statement is a powerful reminder, we believe, that as with every radically new innovation, successful AI isn't just a matter of designing cutting-edge features and algorithms, but designing also the psychology and the sociology behind how we think about these features and algorithms. So the magic is not in the features per se, but in the fact that behind every robot or behind every algorithm, there is a human manager, that would be you, designing how consumers might approach and interact with your AI. In other words, the magic lies in asking what meanings we might elicit and what meanings we might downplay around these features. That balancing act is the key managerial skill that decides whether consumers make your AI a member of their living sort of environment and their family, or whether it ends up disconnected and tucked away in a box in our basement. So success in consumer AI is a function of understanding what we as a society define as the limits of acceptable speech around a particular AI product or service. The important thing to remember is that we believe for consumer AI, these limits are real, but they're evolving. And as you sort of interact with the marketplace, as marketers, you can certainly push those limits as well. So you can push the psychological and cultural possibility space around your consumer AI solution. And that is what we argue will make your consumer AI solution truly captivating and magical. So this is what we have for you. And I think there's now some time for discussion and questions.
Yes, thanks very much, Stefano and Marcus. That was great. A reminder to the audience, please send your questions directly through the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. I want to pick up, Marcus, and either of you might want to respond to your comments towards the end there. The Arthur Clarke quotation about new technology seeming like magic. A well-established principle about perceptions of risk is that people tend to fear the thing that is unknown, and importantly, the thing that they don't believe they have control over. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you could maybe extrapolate from your work to the role of perceived control when it comes to new technologies and AI. I like your notion of reframing and sort of shifting the objections, but presumably one way to do that would be to give a sense and hopefully the reality of more control over how these AI devices and services interact with consumers. So just briefly, your thoughts about the role of perceived control by consumers.
Maybe, can I take that, Marcus, maybe?
Absolutely.
So I think earlier you make a good point. And I think there are probably at least two levels you could answer a question like that. I think the first question about really the immediate consumer environment, and for example, the trust that we need to engender in the market to ensure that consumers feel that they are indeed being served rather than being used, right? So I usually tell my students, if you don't know what the product you are being consuming in a particular situation, you interact with the company, probably the product is you. And so people may be feeling uncomfortable with a lot of essentially technology and business models that are around monetizing audiences. That might be one general issue. So how do we create systems that reassure indeed the consumer and make sure that people feel for example, Google has done a lot of steps towards making sure that you are able to check what the company knows about you. But there is maybe an even more general way of answering that question, which I think relates to our notion of dystopias, which is, well, change is always threatening to people, is always difficult for people. And what we've seen in the last few years, it's just a breakneck change in the many technologies, and the stuff like a self-driving car only 10 years ago was science fiction. Now we're actually thinking about what self-driving features your next car will have. And that's a crazy thought if you think about it, just from the perspective of only very few years ago. So I think change is always scary to people. And to me, and we're just totally speculating because we don't have any evidence of this, but my impression, the graph that Marcus showed you with that very steep increase in the incidence of those dystopian words and uses in the media articles about AI, to me, probably a lot of it simply has to do with how much society is changing because of these breakthrough technologies, and to what extent simply the natural fears that people have when things change maybe faster than they manage to really handle.
That's great, and actually that relates to a question that one of the audience raised just now. Nandini raised the question about why you would expect there would be a decline in references to the dystopias over time. Is it just the assumption that as people become more familiar with the technology and the capabilities that they're less concerned about that? Or what was your thinking in predicting a decline instead of the increase that you actually found?
Right. So initially, if we were to argue using a classic sort of diffusion of innovation lens, we would expect the acceptance of these consumer AI solutions to increase over time as information about their benefits has become more widespread in society. What we did not expect is that there is, while these sort of stories and while this information disseminates, along with it also disseminate the fears and the negative associations that consumers have. So I think initially especially when we approach this from, let's say, a classic STEM sort of software engineering or engineering perspective, we expect that, consumers are as fascinated with our solutions as we are, the ones who, as innovators, develop them. And that's why I think it would be at least initially intuitive to assume that these fears would go down. What we indeed see then is that the conversations we have as a society around these technologies is often very much driven and constrained by the fears that we have in sort of articulating the relationship that we might be able to imagine with these technologies. So to go back to the previous question about being in control and being in charge, each of these dystopias tells a story about how humans are not in charge and how we have become disempowered and maybe alienated or enslaved by technology. So I think for us as marketers, it's very important to remember that the star in all of this is not the technology, it's the consumer. And it's understanding that, we need to sort of be driven by the principle of empowering the consumer and not by empowering a technology that sort of interacts with consumers in, ways that might lead to cheaper prediction, even though that's important too. But we think that really the star is the consumer. And as soon as consumers really naturally accept their empowerment around these technologies, then I think the acceptance goes up and those dystopias become less and less important.
That's a good point, Marcus, and it actually dovetails with a question that just came up from Praveen, and saying, paraphrasing, Alexa, by gathering the data that she does, generates revenue for Amazon, enhances their understanding of consumer behavior. And you can sort of ask, what's in it for the consumer? Isn't this sort of Amazon making money off of the information gathered from consumers with no direct benefit to the consumer? So what would your response, or how would you reframe that sort of concern or objection?
But maybe going back to my earlier answer about the previous question about perceived control in the business models, it's actually, we brought Alexa as a case of always on because there's been so much discussion in such a prevalent product. But in fact, Amazon as a company, I think, is shielded from some of the concerns a consumer may have about the use of AI in business. And I think this is what Praveen's question really is about. It's about the business model underpinning the use of AI. Companies like Facebook and Google, they essentially draw audiences by providing services, which then enable companies to make money by charging third parties for access or information or whatever, advertising platforms and so forth. Amazon has a different model. They mostly use AI to increase the relevance of their offerings and to ensure that their operation runs very smoothly. So Amazon has a different business model where they basically want to interact with the consumers and charge consumers directly for those benefits that consumers have by interacting with Amazon. That's fundamentally different from the business model of other tech companies, which instead offer free services, which are then monetized in other ways by relying on other parties, for example, through advertising sales. But indeed, that's a broader question about the business models that are leveraging AI. In our paper, we don't quite explore that question of the interaction between dystopian myth and different business models around AI. But certainly that would be a very interesting area for future research.
Okay, that's great. I wonder just briefly if you think there might be generational differences in accepting that. It sounds like if a generation has grown up expecting that digital assistants would understand their needs and kind of learn over time and anticipate, predict what would be needed, that would become a matter of course, and I wouldn't be as concerned if I saw a direct benefit to me. Maybe I sort of relax my concerns about privacy issues, or I know at least that I'm getting something in exchange for that information. So have either of you had a chance to see whether this plays out differently across generations in terms of the acceptance of AI?
I think the general goal that we have for this paper is to offer a broader framework that then can provide a springboard for future scholarship around more specific questions such as this one. But I think it's also important to remember that when we look at our model and when we look at the dystopias, it becomes very clear that every generation of consumers is exposed to its own repertoire of cultural mythologies around AI and around technology. For instance, I grew up in the 90s and was very much inspired by Terminator. That just is something that has to do with my upbringing, my socialization, and the kind of exposure that I had to media around that era. So I think one way to answer this question would be to say that it's worth analyzing mass cultural discourses around AI, around consumer technology more broadly, and how different generations get exposed to different repertoires and different, if you will, assortments or libraries of stories around AI. I think it would be a mistake to argue that younger consumers are generally more open to AI solutions than older consumers, but I think it's more complex in the sense that the amount and the types of contents of media consumption that we're exposed to have a profound influence on shaping how we think about AI, consumer AI. And then also in terms of the model that we provide, don't forget they're interacting. So there's an element of time here, and the different categories do not exist in an isolated fashion. So whether or not we end up thinking about one type of capability more than about another is ultimately something that managers can influence and steer.
If I can add just one small point to that, I just in addition to the kind of cohort effect that Marcus was pointing out, people born and grow up in different areas have been exposed to different cultural myths, different media products, and so forth. But also, I think some of the effects that we might observe in the AI space are to some extent transitional. So if you imagine now a lot of these technologies are becoming mature, now. And so people also got to get used to them. So imagine, Marcus mentioned earlier Spotify playlist. And for many people, just switching away from CDs or to a streaming service or so is a big step. And that big step may come with a lot of fears and maybe also, anticipations, but also some concerns. And those might, over time, dissipate or change as you get used to and you explore and you realize that things are good or bad or different. And somehow you learn. So I think there's some of this, I think a lot of these myths are especially interesting, I think, in the context of technology adoption. When you haven't used the technology and you're thinking about, should I buy Alexa? And then you say, you know what, this idea of the machine listening to me all the time freaks me out, I won't. So I think dystopian myths are very interesting to think about in terms of barriers to adoption. Once consumers have adopted, those are still relevant, but over time, those thoughts are also likely to change if people actually get used to using the products.
That's a good point, both of you. And it actually relates to something that one of the audience raised a few minutes ago, and that is maybe we sort of need countervailing myths. In some sense, the notion of always on equaling safety or personalization is kind of a counter myth, if you will. It's the putting the benefit into a human context that people can relate to, you know, the picture of the baby and the baby monitor use of the always on device. It sounds like that's the kind of thing you would expect to evolve as objections are raised. The industry, the people that are interested in promoting adoption of AI solutions will come up with what amounts to their counter myths or counter stories to begin to address it. Just your thoughts about that.
Yes, absolutely. And if we look at our model, it provides this sort of repertoire that managers can in fact use to cull or develop these counter myths and develop counter mythic strategies, if you will, that serve to undermine the negative associations that consumers and other marketplace stakeholders might have pertaining to a particular type of consumer AI solution. So, but strategically, when it comes to writing the paper, what we did not want to offer is a catalog of counter myths, because it's not that simple. So we cannot just assume that there are 4 counter myths that managers can just readily draw upon to address an AI dystopia or the kind of negative associations that go along with it. The reason being that for every industry and every product category, these interact in dynamic and sometimes unforeseen ways. That's one, I think, very important takeaway for managers, that the ecology of storytelling around consumer technology and consumer AI in particular is interactive, and that the capabilities and dark sides that we have and how we think about them as consumers and what they mean to us are sometimes shaped by considerations and meanings and images that we might have in another category. So I think it's a case-by-case basis, and I think we see this a lot in our research and also maybe in the companies that we work with and that we advise, that counter myths are a matter of sort of careful development, and everything that we need to do as marketers is, I think, the most important first step is to monitor the kinds of cultural conversations that take place, and then use the model as guidance to better understand what kind of counter myths we might be able to develop in order to successfully address those challenges.
I think that's a good cautionary note, that this is not a simple cookbook approach to just coming up with a formula and reversing the polarity of the terms or something. And that relates to a question that came up a few minutes back, and that is, and you said yourself, this is kind of a conceptual framework, a theory that managers can use to begin thinking about these issues. But have you, in fact, seen examples of where this has been successful? I know you've applied this approach in other categories besides AI, the sharing economy and so forth. So are there examples maybe you could cite where this type of counter strategy has, in fact, been successful and led to adoption of the technology or
So if there are a couple of things about that. I think our paper is a conceptual paper. What we do in the paper is to think carefully about these dystopias and make some propositions and ideas about how companies can work with each of them. We came up with a general idea of reassure, reframe from just seeing what companies are doing outside of the domain of technology. So these are ways of dealing with consumer concerns, which it's easy to find examples for. In the paper, we mentioned a couple. An example of course, reassure is quite straightforward. You make sure that you tell people it's okay, it's not dangerous, or it's not a problem, or we are not doing this, or the product is not actually having that feature, or whatever. The reframe, it's a bit more sophisticated in some way, you could argue. One nice example, I think, from the history of advertising, the Got Milk campaign. The picture of these people with a milk mustache that became a very popular campaign for many years, trying to promote the consumption of milk. And the idea there was to basically not deny that the milk was not glamorous, so that was a very simple, homey kind of product, but exactly build on that perception to turn milk consumption into a confident, maybe even a flamboyant behavior. So in that sense, they used let's say, the public perception of milk, turn it on its head and make it something cool. And I think this is in a very different context, of course, but the general pattern of reassuring the frame, I think it's easy to observe it in practice. What we have done also as part of other research projects that we conduct around spaces of technology, of course, we also do empirical research of different types. Marcus, for example, is a sociologist and a cultural theorist, and he does in-depth analysis of cultural trends and using ethnography, interviews, and methods like that. I'm an experimentalist. I do basically experiments in the lab or online, try to get if to see if certain manipulations in an experimental design do produce changes in behavior that can be observed and predicted. And so we also do research related to, I think broadly speaking, the domain of technologies, and also touching on some of these dystopian myths. For example, I've done a couple of papers related to the notion of human replacement by machines, both in the domain of consumption and in the domain of work in terms of technological employment. And I'd be happy to tell more to those interested, maybe in a follow-up email conversation.
Yeah, that's great. We will be sharing some email addresses so that the audience can reach out and contact you about additional work that you've done and maybe some of the questions that we haven't had a chance to get to. There was a question Gaurav raised about how this may change multi-channel experience vehicles, different, sensory informational experience context. As you think, maybe the broader context, and I think a related concept would be one of the other questioners asking about as we increasingly move to voice interaction with AI. It's a lot of it is still, more text-based and easily thought of as kind of a dialogue with a computer, but as it becomes increasingly voice-based and voice recognition and synthesis gets better, it's seemingly more of a human-type interaction. Do you see changes happening as this sort of development occurs that would become sort of a more humanoid interaction, if you will?
So it's a very interesting topic for research. I think there's a couple of research groups I know are starting to explore this idea of more natural ways of interacting with technology. We are used to interacting with the technology through interfaces and devices like terminals, keyboards and mouse and so forth. All of a sudden, we are able to speak to machines. And there are interesting questions that come with that. I think the literature is very much in its infancy. I don't think there is a lot of work actually being published on this already, but I know that there are quite a lot of people are looking into it. I've also started at least exploring some ideas in that space. I think there's a lot of hypotheses you can make. I think something I can do is to interaction with technology might be more likely to rely on psychological processes that are active when we interact with people, because we speak usually to people more than type, or at least we're used to that. So would it be that people are more driven by emotion, for example? I have a colleague here in Rotterdam who has a paper showing that if you speak your preferences versus press a button to express your preference, for example, a vending machine, you do make different choices in terms, for example, of buying vice food versus virtue food, right? So you're more indulgent or less indulgent. And so there are interesting questions to go in that domain. Another interesting question to me is turning that to its head and think about what are the increasing interactions we have with machines through natural means of communication, such as voice, going to do to our communication with other individuals. For example, if people start to learn to be rather terse and rude speaking to Siri, will they be more terse and rude when talking to humans in the real social environment? Those are also interesting questions that we don't really know the answer to.
That's great. And one last question, I think it relates to that topic, was actually raised earlier, but now seems an appropriate time. And that is if you've actually done either experimental studies or the observational work that Marcus does, to determine at this stage of people's acceptance, are they more likely to trust a human agent they perceive to be a human agent, or maybe they know to be a human agent, the advice and recommendations that come from that source versus some kind of AI algorithm where they know, again, that's the source of the advice. So do you see a difference at this point?
Yeah, there's actually a lot of research being done on that. And the general finding that is documented in the literature is that people do tend to trust and want to rely more on expert or on advice from humans and machines. And the general effect goes under the level of algorithm aversion, often said. And yeah, indeed, that's something that we also observe in our own studies. For example, we've done some experiments in collaboration with colleagues from the law faculty here at Erasmus and a PhD student called Gizem Yalcin, where basically we asked people to read a case, a legal case, and then told them that either was going to be a human judge or an algorithm making decisions about this case. And what we do find that people have a much less intention to submit the case to court when they know that the case is going to be adjudicated by a machine. So, and we do find that people indeed trust less automatic or artificial judges than human judges. We observe that in a number of domains. Now, is that a transitional effect? Things will change presumably over time as people get more used to this automated decision making. But indeed is an important barrier now for the adoption of a lot of these automatic services, I would say.
Mm. If I might add to what Stefano just said, just 2 weeks ago, there was a really fascinating conference happening in Washington at the George Washington University, co-chaired by Donna Hoffman and Tom Novak. And if I recall correctly, this was a MSI sponsored conference, at least to some extent. So there was a wealth of different scholars and scholarship looking at exactly those kinds of questions. What I think we need to remember is that we're very much at the beginning of all of this, of probably understanding not just how consumers respond to algorithms, but how consumer AI as an experience might be properly understood. So as we embark upon this frontier, and different colleagues presented at this conference and interact frequently with MSI, including Christian Hildebrand, Anindya Ghosh, ourselves, Donna and Tom, and many others. So I think the good news for managers is that there is a wealth of scholarship that is looking into the complexities of consumer AI and how we might better understand and manage those AI experiences down the road.
I think I can certainly confirm that we're seeing here at MSI a lot more requests for support from MSI for research looking at consumer response to AI, robotics, and so forth. So I think you are all, you're very much on target with kind of trends both among academics and marketing, and certainly our member companies that are interested. And with that, I just want to thank you both for a very interesting discussion today. Thanks to the audience for joining us. We will be sending out a recording of the webinar soon. And if you have additional questions about the presentation, you can follow up with Marcus at bigdesignlab.com. I want to remind the audience that since 1961, nonprofit MSI has brought together the best minds in marketing from major corporations and top business schools around the world to improve business practice by applying science to marketing's biggest challenges. And with that, I believe, the email address for Stefano is spuntoni, spuntoni @rsm.nl. Sorry about that, Stefano.
No.
So again, I'm sure both of them would be happy to hear from you and answer further questions and share their research with you. And again, thanks to the audience. Thanks to Stefano and Marcus for the presentation. And we hope you will join us for our next lunch webinar series soon.